Good to be with you. So now we're going to travel back in time about 1,500 years from what Dr. Williams was talking about. And I'm going to present some archaeological evidence that establishes the Exodus as an historical event. Last night, Dr. Williams gave us a great presentation on the reliability of the Bible, and now we're going to hone in on some particular stories. I'm going to focus on a slightly different aspect of establishing the historicity, and that is through archaeological artifacts and sites that have been excavated in those times and places that the stories in the Bible are talking about, particularly the Exodus. One of the major criticisms that comes against this story is that it was just invented at a later time to come up with either political and religious propaganda or theological truths that aren't based on history. And skeptics, they claim that because our earliest texts of Exodus, for example, come from the Dead Sea Scrolls, perhaps the 2nd century BC, that it could have been written any time before that. But we're going to look at some specific examples that show us that it was a real story and the events occurred actually when the Bible says they occurred in the 1400s BC. First, though, we're going to start with the pre-Exodus period, and that is when the Israelites or the Hebrews were in Egypt and became enslaved. So chronologically, we're looking at the period about 1600 to 1446 BC. And we're looking here at ancient Egypt. Most of it is occurring in the northern part of the map here, in the Nile Delta, and even on the eastern side of that. This is a land that the Bible calls Goshen. We get this date, 1446, from synchronizing the Bible's chronology and chronology of the ancient king lists and other accounts that the cultures like Egypt and Assyria put together. So 1 Kings 6:1 tells us that in the 480th year after the Israelites came up out of Egypt, in the 4th year of King Solomon's reign. So we get 479 years after the Exodus is the 4th year of King Solomon's reign. And without getting into the reasons why, Solomon's reign is basically agreed upon by almost all scholars as starting in 970 or 971 BC. So we simply add 479 onto that year, and we get 1446 BC plus or minus. Maybe it was a year earlier, maybe it was a year later. With calendar differences, maybe it was a few years later, but it's very close to that. We also have another important reference in Judges, just for us to double check ourselves, and it talks about how Israel had been in the land for about 300 years by the time of Jephthah, who was a judge in about 1100 BC. So add 300 onto 1100, you have 1400, add about 40 years of wandering onto that, about 1440 BC. So the Bible's internally consistent there with the dates for the Exodus and the conquest also. Before the Israelites are in Egypt, or I should say the Hebrews, they are living in Canaan. And then Joseph's family comes in. This is just an illustration. It is actually from before the time of Joseph, closer to the time of Abraham, but gives you an idea of people from the land of Canaan, the promised land, Semites, they're often called, coming into Egypt. These particular people are actually immigrating into Middle Egypt. Joseph's coat of many colors is talked about, and you see there on the right this guy is wearing sort of like a tunic of many colors. So it was a clothing type known from that time. And then there's an important site in northern Egypt in this Nile Delta region, and it's usually called Avaris. That was one of the ancient names of it, but the archaeological name is Tel El Daba. Archaeological sites in the Middle East usually have the word tel before them, and it just simply means mound. They're often built on mounds, or the cities would pile up a little bit over the years. But this particular city is very important because it is the city that the Bible calls Ramses, where the Israelites or the Hebrews appear to have been centered during their time in Egypt. They likely lived in other places also, but most of them lived around here, and this is where they originally immigrate to. This has been excavated by an Austrian team for decades now, and so we're fortunate enough to know a lot about this site. And what we know is that people from Canaan, Semites, actually came and settled here in a time called the Middle Bronze Age. So about the time of this wall painting here, and also back here, what we're looking at after the time of Joseph, they continued to live in this area. We also know that people of the same large ethnic group of the Hebrews, the Semites, they lived in various other areas in this eastern Nile Delta region. So up here on the map, we've got several cities, and a few of them like Maskuda, Dafena, Yehudia, and so forth. We have evidence of these Canaanite or Hebrew people. We can't tell their specific tribal group from the culture, from the material culture, like the artifacts that they leave behind. So we can only say broadly, people from this region where the Hebrews migrated from came and lived in the Nile Delta region. But we have other evidence that's more definitive we'll look at. For example, this narrows it down a little bit more. Semitic names are found on some inscriptions from around the time of Joseph and later. We even have some with the name Jacob. Now, this is probably not referring to the Jacob in Genesis. He was a fairly insignificant character in the history of Egypt and in world history. But you can see that the name was in use at that time. We have structures, architecture that these people brought over with them. We have tools that they brought over with them. We have pottery that they brought over with them. All right, so this material culture tells us very definitively that there are people from where the Hebrews had lived in Canaan who came and moved to Egypt and settled there at the time that the Bible tells us they lived there. There's even this really interesting statue here, the top picture. It's broken, but we know from the hairstyle and from the pigment colors that now you can't see that it was depicting an Asiatic, as the Egyptians would call them, or somebody from the region of Canaan. And this was a ruler. Now, some have argued that this could be a statue of Joseph. We don't know for sure. Maybe it is. Maybe it's somebody in a similar position to him that lived a little bit earlier. But it gives us this general evidence. And then after the time of Joseph, we're told that the Hebrews are enslaved. It's Exodus 1:7 through 11. A king arose who did not know Joseph. And if we put the chronologies of Egypt and the Bible together, I think we can say that these people who started enslaving the Hebrews were the native Egyptians that had come back up from the south. They reconquered the north, and this is a period in Egyptian history called the New Kingdom. And if you read Egyptian documents, you find that this is when the Egyptians start enslaving people in mass, and especially Semites, or people from the east. And this, of course, is the time that Moses is born into. And we read in the first chapters of Exodus that the Hebrews are building. They're making mud bricks. They're doing public building projects. This is a papyrus from just prior to the Exodus. And it talks about Semites doing public building projects as part of a massive slave labor. Now, it doesn't mention specific tribal divisions. It doesn't mention Hebrews or Israelites, or it doesn't mention people from the tribe of Manasseh or something like that. But the Egyptians were not concerned with that. They basically divided ethnic groups into regions to the north, east, south, and west of them. So they had, to the east, they had the Asiatics, and to the south, they had the Nubians, to the west, they had the Libyans, and to the north, they had the Hittites. They also could throw Greeks or Aegeans into that mix. So they didn't get too specific. We're also told about brick making, and we know about this process from Egyptian documents of the time too. And we read in Exodus that they were supposed to make a specific quota of them, but then when the straw was taken away, they weren't able to. The straw is essential to hold this mud brick together while it's still wet. We actually have documents from around the time of the Exodus in Egypt that talks about brick making quotas, and it talks about people running out of straw even. So it fits within that time period. It's not that we have a document that's talking about the Hebrews specifically having their straw taken away from them, but it's at that time in Egypt, so it's something that was going on. Other slavery is depicted on tomb paintings. This is where we get most of our artwork from ancient Egypt, inside a tomb. It's preserved. They painted with organic paints, and they stay like that for thousands of years. So we have here Semites, which the Hebrews would fit into, and they're doing agricultural labor. This one's very famous. It's from a tomb of Rekhmirah, who was a vizier under the Pharaoh Thutmose III, who ruled just before the Exodus. And in here we see Semites are actually making bricks and then building with them. So exactly how we see things described in the first couple chapters of Exodus. Moses, we're told, accidentally kills an Egyptian for beating one of the Hebrew slaves. And this was a practice that we know of, again, from this Rekhmirah tomb painting, that the Egyptian taskmasters did. Here, there's an Egyptian, he's got a rod in his hand, and he's ready to hit the guys to motivate them to work if they're not working as they should be. These particular guys he's about to hit are Nubians, but we have in this mural, we have Nubians, we have Semites, and other people that were enslaved. All right. What about some of the locations? I mentioned Ramses already, but in Exodus 1:11 we're told that they built the cities, or they built storage facilities in the cities of Ramses, Pithom, and then in the Greek Septuagint version they add Heliopolis. These are real cities. They're cities that existed during the time just prior to the Exodus, and they're cities that we have evidence of Semites living in, especially in the city of Ramses. And again, these are all centered in this eastern Nile Delta region. So Ramses, or Tel El Daba, is up there in the north. Just south of it is Pithom. We don't know exactly which site, but it's probably one of two right there. And then just a little bit farther down is Heliopolis, or On. That's the city where Joseph's wife was from. And in fact, the excavator of the city of Ramses, or Avaris, actually turned up recently some massive storage silos that were built during the time of Thutmose III, who reigned just before the Exodus. He calls them enormous storage facilities, and they set up among them numerous silos. So it's possible that these could actually be the storage facilities that the Israelites helped build in that city. Now, maybe they built some earlier than this. We don't know exactly. Exodus doesn't tell us precisely when in this period between the end of Joseph's life and the Exodus they built these, but this is what's been found, so that could be it. There's also a palace of the Exodus Pharaoh that's there. And again, we see in the narrative, Moses and Aaron go to that palace many times. Here's a drawing of Ramses, the town of Ramses in Avaris. Okay, so this was later a very important Egyptian capital. It was very important also during the time just prior to the Exodus, but then I'll mention later it was abandoned about the time of the Exodus. Pithom, we know that this was called in Egyptian a city called Per Atum, or the house of Atum. We don't know exactly which site it was. It's likely one of two. I have a preference, but we do have documents in ancient Egypt that talk about construction occurring at this town, so we know it existed. Heliopolis, this has undergone a little bit of excavation. This obelisk from Heliopolis was put there by Thutmose III, pre-Exodus period, so again, this could be some of the building that the Hebrews and others were involved in. He also had them build a thick wall around the temple there, we know from a stele, which is a large stone inscription. So all this stuff getting built right before the time of the Exodus by slave labor. There's a pharaoh queen named Hatshepsut who may mention the Israelites or the Hebrews with another term. And she talks about how she's sort of fixing things from when they were messed up, when these Asiatics had ruled in the Delta region before, the Hyksos they're called. And then she mentions these other people, vagrants, or some have suggested the translation sheep herders, who lived in their midst. Now, archaeologists have dug up a lot of sheep bones from this city and from the fields outside the city, and it's a specific type of long-haired sheep that actually comes from the area of Israel today, from ancient Canaan. So they brought their sheep in with them. We know they were sheep herders. But she mentions these vagrants, maybe sheep herders, and then she says they ruled without the sun. What does that mean? Well, basically it means that they did not worship the Egyptian sun god Ra. The Hebrews, of course, they didn't worship Ra. Now, there could have been Canaanites who she is including in this, but we see definitely that there are some people that fit the description of the Hebrews in there, and they're talked about by the Egyptians themselves. As a side note, Hatshepsut, I personally think that she was the daughter of Pharaoh that had Moses pulled from the Nile. Chronologically, this fits. She's a young girl during the time that Moses was born, and she's actually the only daughter of Pharaoh that survives past infancy in this time period. So she's the only person that we know of that could possibly fit this role. They also, this daughter of Pharaoh in Exodus is an Egyptian title that we see during this period, daughter of the king. So again, Moses, who wrote Exodus, he lived in Egypt, he was educated in Egypt, he knew the Egyptian language, he knew the terminology, and we see that throughout the book. He's very familiar with their terms, he's familiar with their government. You find many Egyptian words and phrases actually in the Torah or the Pentateuch, the books of Moses. We'll skip that. Okay, now to what I think is one of the most interesting things about the evidence for the Exodus. And if you read archaeological or historical books about the Exodus, you often see assertions by scholars that they don't believe in the Exodus because they say there's no evidence for it. There's no indication from Egypt that Israelites or Hebrews ever lived in Egypt. And that's one of the main criticisms of it. The other they say is there's no evidence that the Israelites were in Egypt because their later culture doesn't reflect that. I'll say a few things about that later, but this is very important. If we don't have evidence that the Hebrews were in Egypt, we are lacking a very important part of the Exodus story. This particular papyrus, though, helps us with that immensely. This is in New York. It's in the Brooklyn Museum. It's usually just called the Brooklyn Papyrus. And it dates to maybe 1700 to 1600 BC. Some would put it slightly earlier. It's in sort of a murky period of Egyptian history where we don't have really precise dates. But in this time, essentially late in the life of Joseph, or maybe a little bit after him, and we see 95 names on this list. It's actually a pretty boring document, except for what we're going to find out about it. It's just a list of household servants. Not that big of a deal. It's not some interesting story. But we have 37 Semitic names on here. And it lists their original name, and then it lists their new Egyptian name. Now, if you remember back in Genesis, Joseph is actually given a new Egyptian name. So he had both a Hebrew and an Egyptian name. This substantiates that process. But even more importantly, we actually have Hebrew names, specifically biblical Hebrew names, that appear on this papyrus. And they are servants in Egypt prior to the Exodus. So I've highlighted them. Most of the names are in the feminine form. They're female names. Most household servants were female. They used the men to go make bricks and build buildings and so forth. But Menahem, for example, familiar with that name. Asher, that's one of the names of the sons of Jacob, also of the tribe, and it's a name that got used throughout. Shiphrah, we actually see this in the early part of the book of Exodus. It's one of the midwives. Then there's Akoba, or Jacob. Okay, these are written in Egyptian hieroglyphs, so sometimes the letters don't transfer 100%, but you can tell what name they are typically. There's another one that looks like Job, another that looks like a feminine form of Issachar, and then we have David in a compound name. Dawidi Huat, my beloved is he. We have a Hebrew name that actually doesn't occur as a name in the Bible, but it is derived from Hebrew. A sebto, and this is a word, a Hebrew word that means herb. And then Chaya, which is Eve's name. And then finally, there's one that appears to be the Egyptian rendering of Hebrew here. And maybe somebody had just adopted that as their name, or their parents gave that to them as their name. The tribal name or the sort of ethnic designation, they got that. So if anybody says, oh, there's absolutely no evidence that Hebrews lived in Egypt, you can say, well, the Brooklyn Papyrus has Hebrew names on it from prior to the time of the Exodus. I think this is definitive evidence that we do have Hebrews living in Egypt. There's really no better evidence that you could ask for. I talked about material culture like pots and artifacts. You can't necessarily tie that to a particular ethnic group or tribe. But names are extremely specific. So when we have something that detailed, we can say, yeah, this piece of evidence shows us there were in fact Hebrews or Israelites living in Egypt prior to the Exodus. But what about other events? What about the plagues, for example? It's a pretty significant event. Now, typically, ancient cultures did not record their failures, so this isn't something that we would expect to find in the official annals of the Pharaoh, but it's something that a regular person could have recorded. There is a particular papyrus that might relate to the plagues of Exodus. And this is called the Admonitions of Ipuwer. There's only one copy of it known in the world. It's in a museum in the Netherlands. And it's a poem, basically, in sort of a lamentation form, written by this wise man named Ipuwer, an Egyptian. And he's addressing it to someone he calls the All-Lord, which most scholars think is Amun-Ra. It could have been a different god, but likely it's this chief god of Egypt at that time. And he's basically complaining to him about all this terrible stuff that's going on in Egypt. This particular papyrus dates to the 13th century BC, so it's maybe 150, 200 years, something after the Exodus. All right, so if it's recording a prior event, it has to come after. It does. It's not too far in time, though. Most scholars, though, date its composition to much earlier than the Exodus. Say 1850 to 1600 BC is a pretty popular date for it now, but they're presupposing that it's talking about one of the intermediate periods in Egyptian history, probably the second intermediate period. There's a new work on this papyrus that just came out a few years ago, and one of the foremost Egyptologists has done a linguistic analysis of it, and a few other very famous Egyptologists have done the same thing also. You can basically pull together reasons to allow the possibility that it was composed as late as the 18th dynasty. Now the 18th dynasty is the time that the Bible places the Exodus in. In hard dates, we're going to say 1570 to 1400 BC is the part of the 18th dynasty that they might be able to linguistically date its composition. So it was composed after the Exodus. It could have been composed right around the time of the Exodus. And what do we have in here? Hardship and death in Egypt. There are descriptions similar to some of the plagues of the Exodus. So a few scholars have hypothesized it is an Egyptian remembrance in poetic form of the time of the plagues. Let's look at a few examples. On the left we have the papyrus, on the right we have Ipuwer, or on the right we have Exodus. So we have the river turns to blood in both narratives. Okay, that's a very strange thing, but just one thing, all right, maybe that's a coincidence. We have talk about fire all over the place. Again, this could be coincidence. It's not as specific as the rivers turning to blood, but then below that you have the grain has been destroyed. And in Exodus 9, that's the results of one of the plagues. The grain gets destroyed. You have children dying in the papyrus here. Lots of death and so forth. And of course we have the firstborn throughout all the land are killed. And lots of death. We have groaning, lamentations throughout the land, the great cry in Egypt. The firstborn of Pharaoh dies in the Exodus narrative. And we hear the land is deprived of kingship. Maybe it's figurative, maybe it's literal. The next king has been killed. And then the final thing, though, is very specific, like the river is blood part. And it tells us how the slaves now have all these treasures. Gold and lapis lazuli, silver and malachite, carnelian and bronze are fastened on the neck of female slaves. And we know in the Exodus, at the end of the plagues, they went and requested or took from the Egyptians all this jewelry and this gold and silver and so forth. So you put all those together in the same document from that time period, extreme period of hardship and turmoil and transition in Egypt, and you can make an argument that this is an Egyptian remembrance of the period of the plagues. Another aspect of the evidence for the Exodus has to do with the Pharaoh. Now, there have been various theories about who was the Pharaoh of the Exodus, and I think that we can answer that question fairly well. But in looking at that, we can also further establish the historicity of the Exodus. So if it is a particular real Pharaoh, and all these Exodus events are happening during his reign, then there should be things in Egyptian history during his reign that match the Exodus narrative. First, we look at chronology. So according to the chronology of the Exodus in the Bible, matching up with Egyptian chronology, it's during the reign of a pharaoh called Amenhotep II. All right, that doesn't particularly tell us anything except for, let's look at Amenhotep II, see what matches. Well, we know that his predecessor ruled 54 years, first of all. So let me get to the more detailed slides. And this is important because he's the only pharaoh anywhere near the Exodus that had a reign length of over 40 years. Why does that matter? The Bible tells us that the pharaoh preceding the Exodus pharaoh ruled for over 40 years. Moses killed that Egyptian by accident. He ran off to Midian. 40 years later he returns when God tells him that that pharaoh has died. So this is a requirement. And it seems to fit with Thutmose III and Amenhotep II. Another reason, we have military decline in this Pharaoh's reign. And the previous guy, Thutmose III, was an amazing military commander. And he conquered all sorts of places, expanded Egypt's influence immensely. But then in the reign of Amenhotep II, all of a sudden, boom, Egyptian campaigns stop. And you really don't have anything significant for about another 100 years. So there seems to be a period of recovery. In fact, in documents or letters that are written between Egypt and Canaan in this intermediate period, this recovery period, as we might call it, the Egyptians seem totally uninterested and even unable to provide military support to Canaan, which was one of their vassal regions and sort of a buffer zone between them and some more powerful enemies to the north. There's also a slave raid recorded by Amenhotep II. Now, when the Hebrews go out, they're a significant slave force leaving Egypt. And it even says that there's a mixed multitude that goes along with them. So it must have been Hebrews and other people that were enslaved. So Egypt suffers a blow to their economy because they rely on this slave labor for many of their building projects and industry. Amenhotep II, the proposed Pharaoh of the Exodus, he goes into Canaan on a slave raid just after the Exodus, and he claims that he brought back over 100,000 people as slaves. So what's going on here? Most scholars, actually I'm not sure of any, think that he actually took 100,000 people back from Canaan as slaves. They think that he embellished this. Most of the other accounts are a few hundred or a few thousand. Those are the maximum. So he's about 20 times higher number of slaves taken back than any other pharaoh claimed. But if he really did lose all of this slave force in the Exodus, then he needs to go do something and save face. He needs to at least claim that he's recouping some of their losses and make some kind of an effort. So he probably didn't take 100,000 slaves back, but he probably took some and then exaggerated the number, tried to make it look like he wasn't weak, and he went back and maybe even grabbed these people that had escaped. He didn't like Semites. I won't get into detail on that one. This may or may not have anything to do with the Exodus, but obviously he would have some particular hate for Semites if they had left his country in shambles and then vacated. But we have another occurrence here, and that is what he did to the Pharaoh Queen Hatshepsut's monuments. She ruled before Thutmose, so we have Hatshepsut, Thutmose, Amenhotep. And as I suggested before, she may have been the daughter of Pharaoh that pulled Moses from the Nile, raised him. Well, if so, then Amenhotep could place some blame on her for the events of the Exodus. If she hadn't saved Moses, all this stuff wouldn't have happened. And during Amenhotep II's reign, he started defacing her statues and monuments. So here's one. They smashed her face. In many cases, her name in the little Egyptian cartouche, he had that scratched out. Sometimes he put his name over it or the name of his queen. So there's a very intentional defacing and elimination of her memory. This is something that happens later on in Egyptian history. For those of you who have heard of Akhenaten, he's the pharaoh who, he didn't start monotheism in Egypt, but henotheism it's called, elevated one god above the rest. Well, he messed up the religious system. So when they fixed it, the later pharaohs tried to get rid of his name too. He did something that was offensive to the gods, and this is what Amenhotep II could have been thinking about Hatshepsut. He's also was an extremely arrogant pharaoh, so he really fits the profile that we see in Exodus, extremely confident, sure of himself. Here on the left we have a picture of him shooting arrows through a solid copper target. It's impossible. And then he talks about how he was the strongest of all pharaohs in the elephantine stele there on the right. So he's typically thought to be one of the more arrogant pharaohs that ever ruled. And of course, That's what we see in the Exodus story. The son of the Pharaoh, the firstborn son of the Pharaoh, was said to have been killed in the final Exodus plague. And this firstborn would have become the next Pharaoh. Well, the next Pharaoh was a guy by the name of Thutmose IV. And he actually erected this large stele in between the paws of the Sphinx. You can see it popping out there. Here's a close-up, older picture. And in this, he talks about how he went to the Sphinx, he laid down, went to sleep, he had a dream, and one of the gods told him that he would become the next Pharaoh. So he erected this stele that gave him a divine right to the kingship. Now, scholars who are analyzing this are not even thinking about the Exodus. They don't think the Exodus happened, but they say that the reason he did this is because he actually didn't have divine right. His older brother probably died or had suffered something that would prevent him from being king, so he needed legitimacy to become the next Pharaoh. Well, if his father was Amenhotep II, his father was Amenhotep II, excuse me, if his father was the Exodus Pharaoh and his oldest brother died, then he would need to seek divine right for the throne to be the new heir. So again, this fits with the whole story. It fits with Amenhotep II being the Exodus Pharaoh. As I mentioned before, the palace at Ramses or Avaris, it was abandoned during or around the time of the Exodus. It's during the reign of Amenhotep II. This was a military launching point, so if the military suffered a huge defeat, if all these plagues are raining down on this area, you have a reason to abandon that palace for a while. And while archaeologically we don't know exactly what the reason is, the excavators actually suggest it could have been some type of plague. Okay, they're probably talking about a general disease that we're familiar with, but similar conditions. Finally, last piece of Egyptian-specific evidence for the Exodus comes from Manetho, who was an Egyptian priest historian in the 3rd century BC. His writings, some of them were copied into Josephus and others. He had access to records that we no longer have access to. But some of the important things he says talk about an exodus from Egypt of some Hebrew people. Now he actually talks about both a Hyksos expulsion and a Hebrew exodus. Sometimes he mixes things up, but he has the two things happening, and he does have Hebrews in Egypt leaving Egypt. One of the other really interesting things, though, is he actually names the pharaoh Amenhotep, or Amenophis, which is the Greek rendering of that Egyptian name. Josephus inserts that he thinks that Manetho is making this up because he says Amenophis is a fictitious king. Apparently Josephus didn't know that Amenhotep was an actual Egyptian king or pharaoh. But of course we do know that, and it gives more legitimacy to this being an accurate record of what Manetho recorded, transmitted into Josephus, if Josephus is actually objecting to the claims of Manetho. So this ancient Egyptian historian is actually recording that there's some type of exodus from Egypt during the reign of a king named Amenhotep. So that would be the last of all these reasons, these major reasons I would give for Amenhotep II being the pharaoh of the Exodus. And next to that we have further evidence for the Exodus occurring, and specifically in the time that the Bible says it occurs. Now, to wrap it up, we can look at the Exodus as sort of people A in place 1 at time X, okay? Hebrews in Egypt prior to the Exodus. And then we can say, well, for there to be an actual Exodus, we have to have the Hebrews of the Israelites show up in Canaan after that. And in between, there's a little bit of wandering. So relating to the wandering, This is a very, very interesting inscription from an Egyptian temple that comes at the end of the wandering time. And it's an Egyptian temple. So the Egyptians wrote this. And what does it mention? It mentions the land of the nomads of Yahweh. Well, who is Yahweh? He's the God of Israel. He's the God, the one true God that's mentioned in the Bible. How would the Egyptians even know the name Yahweh? Unless they had been exposed to people who believed in him. And at this time, only the Hebrews really knew about him, or people who started worshiping Yahweh were integrated into Hebrew or Israelite community. And it actually places these people, nomads, remember they're wandering for a little bit, and they're even wandering at the beginning of the conquest, places them in between Egypt and Canaan. Now some think it's a little bit south of Canaan, some think it's just east in Jordan right before they cross over. It doesn't really matter that much. It just shows us that they acknowledge there were these wandering people right there before entering into Canaan at the right time, and they worshipped a God called Yahweh. Again, secular scholars do not have any problem with this. Almost all of them acknowledge that this is a reference to Yahweh, the same Yahweh that's found in the Bible. They just don't realize or talk about the implications of it for the historical nature of the Exodus story and so on. I mentioned at the beginning that one of the criticisms is there's supposedly no Egyptian influence on the Israelites. This is not true. I won't get into it in detail, but there are some things like the golden calf, the Ark of the Covenant, the tabernacle, early form of writing used for Hebrews similar to Egyptian hieroglyphs, many Egyptian words and names found in the books of Moses. But finally, ending up in place B, in Canaan at the right time, we have, if the Exodus occurred around 1446, 40 years later the conquest starts, there should be evidence for that and the Israelites in Canaan. This is during the reign of a king called Amenhotep III. And during that time there's destruction and transition in Canaan. This is around 1400 BC. Just after that we clearly see that Israel is established in Canaan. So Jericho, it's destroyed. Hatzor, it's destroyed. Shechem, it's not. There's a peaceful takeover. Okay, you can read about these cities in the book of Joshua. There's a demographic shift. What's that mean? It means that the population hit a peak, and then right when the Israelites come in, there's a drop, and then it rises again. And there are new settlements that come in. And then finally we have written sources that establish Israelites in the land of Canaan after the time of the conquest. Most of this stuff is coming a little over 100 years after they get there. Some of it might be not quite that late, but clearly they're the dominant group in Canaan by the late 13th century BC. So again, we have very specific and we have general or unspecific suggestive evidence of Hebrews, Israelites in Egypt before the Exodus. We have some evidence of Exodus events in Egyptian archaeology and records. We have wandering, the Egyptians familiar with Yahweh, and then we have Israelites established in Canaan after the Exodus. All those things put together, we can have a clear picture that the Exodus story is an historical account. So I'll take any questions now.
Titus, I'm going to take my prerogative as the moderator, just ask why there's such an impressive pattern of evidence that corroborates the Exodus account. Why have scholars missed it heretofore?
I think one of the main reasons they missed it is because much of this evidence has been studied more intensively after most of academia decided that the Exodus was a mythological event. And so looking at it again, or looking at it for the first time, they've already assumed that there was no Exodus and they're not going to make that connection. Also, most scholars dealing with Egyptology are not familiar with the Bible at all. So this stuff wouldn't even enter into their mind. If you asked them to recount the Exodus story for you, I'm sure they couldn't, other than, oh yeah, I've heard of that. It was Israelites were living in Egypt, and Moses, and there were some plagues and stuff.
Chronology has played a role in this too, hasn't it? That people have been looking for scholars. There was a consensus that developed in the 50s about the Exodus. If it happened later. Wasn't that part of it? Yeah,
chronology has been an issue too. So the Bible gives us a chronology which we have to piggyback onto Roman and Babylonian and Assyrian chronologies to piece everything together into our BC system. But the Bible tells us, again, about 1446 was the Exodus event. But in scholarship, in the early 20th century, there was a lean towards it happening about 200 or so years later. So they're looking at a time completely removed from when the Exodus occurred. And so they're going to be missing some of the evidence. And things like the Pharaoh, things like the Ipuwer Papyrus, things like even the city of Ramses or Avaris, you're going to run into some problems with that.
So if you look at the wrong time, you're not going to find the evidence. Titus and I had the privilege of consulting on a video about the historicity of the Exodus, and early on, some of the people working on the film called the people at the Leiden Museum about the Ipuwer Papyrus, and they were told, well, this can't be anything to do with the Exodus, because the Exodus happened in 1200 and this dates from 1350 BC or something like that. So if you look at the wrong time, you get your blinders on and you just miss the evidence that's there. I think that's a big part of the story.